Hello everyone and welcome to another CREY video guide. My name is Scuden and today we'll have a look at dynamics. So, dynamics was recently introduced to CREY and it's a really cool feature which I hope to cast some light upon in this video. I do want to say, before we start off, that dynamics can be pretty abstract and difficult to explain, so bear with me if I fail miserably. Hopefully, by the end of this video, you will understand dynamic objects just a tad bit better, or at least the settings that is provided in the CREY engine. So to begin with, let's just place a primitive here out in the open, and if you double click on that, you'll notice there's something called the physics type in the settings window here. You want to click on that, and then you want to select dynamic here, and well, before we dive into all the different settings, I figured let's just give it a go and hit 9 and see what happens. All right, so basically you can push the ball around. It's like when I say dynamics here, you can just call it physics if that's easier to cope with. But it's basically applying physics, right? Or dynamics. I mean. Use whatever word you want. Dynamics is probably the more correct term, but if it makes it easier to understand, just call it physics. Now, let's open this window again here. You can see there's a variety of different settings, and we'll just go through them one by one. There's more settings in the world settings window, but we'll just get to that in a moment. So, if we start off by looking at the settings here, there's the physics material. There are 3 default presets here, and you can actually create your own ones, and we'll just get to that later. But let's just go with the bouncy here to begin with. And then there's mass, which is like pretty much a measurement of how much matter is in an object. It's not exactly the same as weight, which is more like the pull of gravity an object has, but I mean, again, if it helps you understand it better, it helps me at least to just think of mass as weight, even though it's not actually true. But I mean, whatever floats your boat, and I really think it makes it easier to understand. All right, so and I'll just give a couple of examples of how that works after I've gone through them just quickly. Then there's drag, which is pretty much like air resistance. Then we have angular drag, which is rotation resistance, sort of. We'll just get to that later. Bear with me here because it's pretty difficult to explain. I haven't convinced myself yet that I'll be able to explain this properly, but I'll try as best as I can. So then there's a use gravity, because there is a gravity settings in the world settings. This one makes a lot of sense, I think, and probably should to most of you who are familiar with gravity. And then we have lock movement on X and Y and Z, which is similar to what you have in the Seeker gameplay prop. And also you can lock the rotation on X, Y, and Z. So I doubt that I'll have to explain these, but we can just go through them anyway. So let's say we have mass here. Let me just get another object here and just get that a different color. Just make that black-ish. Now I want them to be sort of on top of each other. Not entirely, but just something like it. Was that okay? Yeah, that was okay. All right. So let's say that this object here below, let's say it has a lot of mass. All right, and let's say that this object on top of it has very little mass. And now what you'll see is that the object on top will barely affect this object here at the bottom, which, by the way, is also a lot harder for me to push around now that it has a lot of mass. So basically, because the object below has way more mass than the object on top is just gonna bounce to the side when it hits this object. But we can just try and switch places with these objects, or just switch masses. So let's give this very little mass. Let's give this object up here a lot of mass. Let's see what happens when we press 9. Alright, so it actually moves the object. It could probably move it around a bit more, depending on how we place it, depending on how it hits. But I guess you sort of get the idea here. Also now, the white one here is the one with a lot of mass. Again, just notice that it's a lot harder for me to push around than it is with this object over here. Okay. So that's mass for you. Ish. Alright. So let's move on to the next one. I'll just delete this one. And let's make this normal again. Something like this. Alright. So now we have drag here, which, as I said before, is sort of like air resistance. So let's say we put this, like, be careful about how much you drag you give it. It's very sensitive, so just stay in the low numbers. Let's say we have two objects here, one with the drag settings and one with 0 drag. The one with 0 drag, we'll give that a color. Let's say it's red here, and you'll just notice the difference here. 0 drag, which is the red one, it falls a lot faster because there's a lot of drag on the right one here. And you can see this one stops very quickly because it has this air resistance. So it applies when it's on the ground. It also applies when it's in the air. This one you can see just sort of keeps going. So that's drag, and it's a super cool parameter that you can play around with. Very important in some cases. Now let's have a look at some of the other settings. Angular drag, for example, which is easy to explain if I use a cube. So let me just delete these two guys over here. And let's make this object dynamic. All right, here we go. Now I want to show angular drag maybe with, let's say, some of these movement locks here. So let's say we actually just lock its movement entirely. And as you can see here, it sort of steps up. Boom. So now we've locked the movement, but we still allow for some rotation. And let's just say that we take angular drag and put that to 0, okay? Let's see what happens when we run into this. You can see it sort of rotates. It has no resistance, so it keeps on rotating and just keeps on rotating and rotating. And as you can see as well, it's not moving at all because we locked the movement. All right, so that's what's going on right here. Now, if we jump into this object again, open the settings, and we apply some angular drag, let's just give it 14. That might actually be too much. We'll see. What you'll see now is that it sort of stops rotating, right? Okay, so that was actually quite a lot of angular drag I just gave it there. Let's give it just maybe like 1, and let's try again. Now you can see it rotates, but then it stops because of the rotation resistance that we gave it with the angular drag. So again, a really cool setting that can be really handy, I think. All right, and then obviously it's time now to look at some of the world settings. Gravity, I don't know if I'm okay. Well, let's just show it anyway because it moves us into the world settings. Go in here, world settings. You'll see that there's a physics tab now. All right, so you can press that one, and then you have all these settings here. And then don't worry, we'll go through them one by one and explain them. But since we're at the gravity, let's just remember this. I'm just gonna copy it. Let's say that we put gravity to just 15 or something, all right? What you'll see is that it just moves the other way. So it's like negative gravity-ish. I guess in some cases you'd want to do this. You can get it like really like slow. Let's say you put 1. All right, so it's slowly just moving on up. Everything that's in minus will move towards the ground, and everything that's in plus will just fly off, basically. Yeah. All right. So now that we've shown this, we can just get that number right again. All right. So here we go. Okay. So I mean, this is the terrain material because you can apply a dynamic material to the terrain as well. It's actually using the regular one now. But let me just explain what a material is. Basically, it's a sort of bunch of presets, settings that you apply to an object or the terrain up here. That sort of determines how much friction does this object have and how much bounciness does it have. And then there's the friction combine and bounce combine. Friction is basically, I mean, how much force should you sort of assert to an object before it starts moving? Let me just show you really quickly. Like we'll do a couple of testing grounds just to make it a bit easier. I'm not even fully convinced. I 100% understand all these settings myself. But again, there's no shame in that. Just a little bit. No, I'm just kidding. There's no shame in that. No, you know, we'll just keep this as it is. No, we'll make it bigger, right? Just like that, right? We'll just get 2 of them. And let's have, let's just give it some color here. Some color there, right? Got a red and we got a blue. And then we will jump into the settings here. And what I actually want to do is I want to create a new material. So a material is a combination of like a name, friction setting, bounciness, friction combine, and bounce combine. So if we press on add new here, we'll just create something called low friction. Okay. And low friction will have a low friction, so that's 0. Then let's create a new one called high friction. Okay. And we'll just set the friction on this one to max, which is the number 1. Now we want to jump into these 2 objects, and let's just take the left one here and say this is, make it a dynamic object first, and then in the physics material, we've just created 2 new ones. So let's choose low friction for this one, and then let's choose the high friction for the blue one. All right. So now we just want to make sure that we have a material for the floor as well. Let's just call this guy the floor. We'll just name it up here so as to not create any confusion. And let's just create a new material here. Say add new. Create one called floor. And let's just give this like friction. I don't even know. Like let's just say a half, right? 1.50. Right. So let's get the character over here. I wanna talk about like 2 settings here, which is the friction. Oh, sorry again. Friction here was like how much force does it take you like to move the object? Like friction, basically. It is what it is, I guess. Like, is there a lot of friction between these 2 objects, or is there no friction at all? Like no friction would be like ice, but we'll see that in a minute. Then there's like bounciness, which is like how much of the energy in the bounce is preserved, like in the next bounce. Is it none of it, or is it all of it? And we'll just I'll show that in a minute. So the friction combine is and the bounce combine is basically when 2 objects that has friction, when they sort of collide, how are they going to interact in terms of their friction, since they have different ones? Like, and then you can say it's gonna apply the maximum friction, or it's gonna apply the minimum, etc., etc. And the same one with the bounce, but it's gonna be easier to understand like once I show it here. So we have the floor here. We made a material for that as well. So we'll just select that. It doesn't have to be a dynamic object. You can still select the physics material here. So now that we have this box here, and we have the low friction setting on that one, I think I want to show you here that if I take the friction combine here and set that to minimum, then it's actually going to, and let me just do the same thing actually for, no, never mind. Let's just take minimum here. What this means is that when this box here, when it slides or sort of moves on this floor here, it's gonna take the minimum settings between the 2 of them, which is basically 0 since we chose that below friction. This means that when I push this one, it's just, there's no friction whatsoever. All right, none. Okay, and since we're using a half here on this one, let me show you what happens if I change this. So if I go into physics, select the low friction, and then friction combine. Let's say I take the maximum. Then you won't see it just slide off because it's actually going to use the one that the floor has. So you can see here, it's not just going to slide, it's going to stop. There's friction between the 2. It's going to behave just totally different. So that's really what happens. It's a way of determining like which object's friction settings should be used when these 2 guys when they meet and slide. Okay. But let's just set this to minimum again. All right, so now for this one over here, This has a very high friction, as we can see here, because we set the high friction, we put that to max. And we'll just say friction combined, we wanted to take the maximum here, okay? Which is this number here. Okay. And you can see it doesn't slide at all. No sliding at all. But what we could do now is we can just go into this one and say, let's use the minimum. Oh, sorry, that was friction. Let's use the minimum here. Did I put this one to max? Sorry guys, a lot of things is happening right now. Just bear with me. Let's just say average for this one. And you see, it slides just a little more than it did before, because it's like using a half. It's not much, it's difficult to see, but it does slide better than it did before. So like hopefully these things make sense. I'll just show you the bounce combine. Let's get another floor here. It's just no need for sliding here, so we'll just do like this. All right. Now we want is just two primitives. I think we can use these spheres here. One here that has dynamics on, and another one here. First, I want to go into the settings here and just check here what the bounce settings is for the floor. Okay, it's set to 0. All right, bounce combine average. Now I want to do 2 new ones. Actually not, because we have something called bouncy here. We'll just put that to max, right? So we'll just let's say bounce combine. Let's say maximum here, and let's apply it to this guy over here, this blue guy. So he has the bouncy here. So there's a lot of bounce in this object right now, and the bounce combine is set to maximum. So like no matter what settings this one has for bounce, like unless it's higher, which it can't be, then it's just gonna keep the settings here. Sorry if this is a poor explanation of it. Like hopefully it makes sense to you. Otherwise I'll just have to do a new video when I understand it even better myself. So let's say, yeah, let's just give it some reddish color here. And let's give this something that is not bouncy at all. Let's try ice, because I don't think that has bounce in it. A little bit. We'll just set that to 0. Okay, and it uses the average. Let's just say it uses the minimum. So what you'll see now is that there's a lot of bounce in this object, and there's not a lot of bounce in this object. It has 0. This has 1. This one is set to bounce combine maximum, so it's going to use the highest number it can find, which is on this one. And this one is set to minimum, so it's going to use like the lowest. So just see what happens here. All right, this one is going to keep bouncing, preserving all the bounce energy. It just keeps on going, while the other one has absolutely no bounce at all. Okay, so this floor here, let me just check what it had. It had 0 bounciness. Okay, so if I go into the bouncy material here, and I set the bounce combine to minimum, then even though this has a lot of bounciness, it's gonna apply like the minimum bounce when it combines with another material, which is this one, and this one has 0, so it shouldn't bounce at all. All right, it doesn't bounce at all. Now, I sort of hope you're starting to see the pattern here. You could then take this one and say, let's use an average here. And then, since this one has 0 bounce and this one has 1, it's going to use like half of that, right? So, see what that looks like. And then half, and then half. So it just keeps on growing smaller. And you can really play around with these settings. You can use the multiply function as well. It is exactly that. It multiplies the 2 numbers. You'll get a value. Since everything is below 1, it's going to be smaller than that, right? Okay, guys. So to not confuse you guys any further, let's just do a quick recap. And basically, like I've been using primitives here all along. You could just take like any object. Let's take the skull here. Right. Take this guy, and let's double click on that guy. Boom. Go to dynamics, and there we have it. Right. So let's just press 9 here and see what happens. There you go. Get this skull bouncing around. You can do this to any object in the game. So just go ahead and get funky with it. I'm really hyped about this new feature, the dynamics. It's going to be super interesting to see how that's going to be used in games. Sometimes like games can just revolve around dynamics, or it can just be a small little feature that's really cool, a nice detail in the game. So I'm super excited to see what you guys come up with. And again, you have the mass. Basically, think of it as weight, even though it's not entirely the same. You have the drag, which is the air resistance, the angular drag, which is like a rotation resistance. We have gravity, movement logs. So like you can do something like with a cannon being shot from over here and over here without it ever leaving this plane here, because you can lock it so it doesn't move in this direction, but only moves like this. You can do cannons, catapults, like mini golf, like all these fun little games I'm looking forward to see. And then that was the object settings. Then there's the world physics settings here. Contains a gravity that is applied for all of them. Here, the terrain material. If you want the terrain to be like ice, then select that one. If you want to create your own, as we did in this video, then feel free, just go ahead and do that. I recommend that all of you just like play around with it until you start getting the hang of it. A lot of you guys will have seen these settings like in other editors, so you may be familiar with them. Please, if I said anything that's not correct in this video, please correct me in the comments. I might have missed something or explained something in a way that wasn't entirely correct. So feel free to do that. I do, however, hope that that you got a little wiser in this video. Those of you who have not encountered dynamics before. Sorry, I just cut myself off there. So terrain material you can select, and you can select material for or create a material here for any asset that you want. Friction is basically how much friction is there, like when this guy slides around. Does he just move like ice, or is that like is there more friction, right? At least I learned today that I'm really bad at explaining friction, but and probably a couple other things as well. Now again, there's bounciness, which is basically how much of the energy in the bounce is preserved. Is it all of it, so it moves like this, or is it just some of it, so it sort of does like this? Then there's the friction combine and bounce combine. Bounce combine, for example, is that when two objects that has certain bounce value, when they hit each other, how much or which one of the settings will sort of okay, that was a really bad explanation. It's basically just when you have two objects that has either bounce or friction, the bounce combine determines the value of that bounce when they hit, the value of the friction when they collide. That is really as good as it gets from my side, guys. I'm really sorry. This is probably the worst guide so far, like in terms of being easily understandable. But I do hope that you learned something, and I'm sorry this video ended up being so long. It's just that it's so difficult, at least for me, to explain these things. But I hope you learned something, guys. I'm looking forward to see what you come up with. Please let me know in the comments if something was very unclear, and I might just do a second round on this dynamic video guide here. But I hope you enjoyed it, and yeah, let me know in the comments what you think. See you all, guys, in the next video. Bye bye.